November 20, 1943, about 900 BTO, Tarawa Atoll. The tide is wrong. It is a neap tide, a quirk of the lunar cycle that the planners had feared but gambled against. The water over the fringing coral reef is barely 3 feet deep. For the hundreds of flat-bottomed Higgins boats churning toward the beach, carrying the bulk of the 2nd Marine Division, this is a death sentence. They slam into the coral shelf hundreds of yards from shore, their ramps stuck fast, their engines screaming uselessly against the limestone. The ramp drops on a Higgins boat, and the Marines inside look out not at sand, but at 500 yards of waist-deep water, whipped into a froth by Japanese machine gun fire. To get to the fight, they have to wade. To wade is to die. But ahead of them, crawling where no boat should be able to move, are the monsters. They look like rectangular steel bathtubs with cleats, churning through the water, hitting the coral shelf, and then, impossibly, climbing. They do not stop. They grind up onto the jagged reef, their tracks biting into the rock, clanking and roaring as they transition from sea to land and back to the lagoon water on the other side. These are the landing vehicles, tracked, the LVTs. For the Marines pinned down in the lagoon, watching their buddies fall into the red-stained water, these ungainly, noisy machines are the only thing going right in a morning that has gone terribly wrong. At Tarawa, the concept of amphibious warfare is being rewritten in real time, written in the grease and diesel fumes of 125 tractors trying to do a job they were never originally built for. To understand why the fate of the invasion of Tarawa rested on the tracks of a converted swamp rescue vehicle, we have to look back 8 years, and 4,000 miles away, to the hurricane-prone wetlands of Florida. The machine was born not for war, but for mercy. In 1935, a wealthy engineer and inventor named Donald Roebling watched from his estate as a devastating hurricane swept across the Okeechobee region. The storm left victims stranded in the deep swamps, places where boats would snag on vegetation and cars would sink in the muck. Roebling, the grandson of the man who built the Brooklyn Bridge, decided to bridge the gap between land and water. He set up shop in his family's construction yard. He wasn't looking for a contract. He was looking for a solution. The result was the Alligator. It was a technological chimera, an aluminum hull that could float, propelled by tracks fitted with curved cleats that acted like paddles in the water and grousers on the mud. It was loud, it was slow, and it was brilliant. By 1937, the Alligator had caught the eye of Life magazine. The subsequent article, featuring a glossy spread of the strange vehicle conquering the Florida mangroves, landed on the desks of the U.S. Marine Corps. The Marines were searching for an answer to a tactical riddle that had plagued them for a decade: how to move men from a ship, across a surf zone, and onto a hostile beach without pausing. Roebling was initially resistant. He told the brass he had built a machine to save lives, not to help take them. But as the shadow of war lengthened over Europe, and the inevitability of a Pacific conflict with Japan became clear, his patriotism outweighed his pacifism. He handed the design over. The military version, designated the LVT-1, was a beast of burden. Delivered to the Navy in July 1941, it was built of mild steel, not armor plate. It could carry 18 fully equipped troops or 4,500 pounds of cargo. It was powered by a Hercules engine that roared like a tractor and smelled of hot oil. But it had a fatal flaw for a combat vehicle. It was thin-skinned. The hull was designed to deflect mangrove roots, not shrapnel. When the war finally came, the LVT was pigeonholed. The brass saw it as a logistical tool, a glorified supply truck that didn't need a dock. On August 7, 1942, the LVT-1 saw its first operational use at Guadalcanal with the 1st Amphibian Tractor Battalion. They were the mules of the operation. While the riflemen fought in the jungle, the Amtrak crews ran a relentless shuttle service from the beachhead to the supply ships. They hauled crates of ammunition, drums of fuel, and sacks of rice. On the return trips, they carried the broken and the bleeding. In the Solomons, the LVT crews learned the hard way what their machines could and couldn't do. The tracks, designed for Florida swamps, were brittle. The coral and sand of the Pacific chewed them up. Maintenance became a nightmare of welded cleats and greased bearings. But the Marines loved them. An LVT could bypass the mud that swallowed wheeled trucks. It could flank a Japanese position by swimming around a river mouth. It was ugly, but it worked. Yet Guadalcanal was a large landmass. The coming Central Pacific campaign would be different. The targets were atolls, tiny rings of sand surrounded by vast, razor-sharp coral reefs. The planners looked at the charts for Tarawa and saw the problem. The Higgins boat, the LCVP, drafted about 3 to 4 feet of water when loaded. The reef at Bitillo often had less than that, even at high tide. If the boats hit the reef, the invasion force would be stranded hundreds of yards from the beach, exposed to the most concentrated defensive fire the world had ever seen. The solution was the LVT, but there weren't enough of them and they weren't armored. Colonel David Shoup, commanding the 2nd Marine Regiment, knew the risks. He stripped the 2nd Amphibian Tractor Battalion of every operational vehicle they had. They scraped together 75 of the older LVT-1s and 50 of the newer LVT-2s. The LVT-2, nicknamed the Water Buffalo, was a significant upgrade. It used the suspension from the M3 Stuart light tank, making it more reliable on hard ground. It was faster and could carry more weight, but like its predecessor, it was unarmored. The men of the tractor battalions improvised. They bolted quarter-inch steel plates to the cabs of their tractors. It wasn't much, barely enough to stop a glancing bullet, and useless against heavy machine guns or anti-tank rounds, but it was better than the mild steel skin the factory provided. They welded machine gun mounts to the rails. They turned supply trucks into assault vehicles. Which brings us back to the reef at Bitillo. It is 900. The naval bombardment has lifted, leaving a pall of dust and smoke over the island. The Japanese defenders, deep in their concrete bunkers and coconut log pillboxes, are not dead. They are waiting. As the naval gunfire lifts, a silence hangs over the lagoon for a heartbeat, broken only by the roar of the tractor engines. Then the Japanese open fire. The water boils. The air fills with the snap and hiss of supersonic lead. The LVTs, waddling over the coral at a top speed of barely 4 or 5 knots, are the only targets in the water. The drivers, sitting high in the forward cabs, hunch behind their bolted-on steel plates, peering through narrow vision slits or simply risking it all to look over the rim. The tracks churn against the reef, throwing up sprays of white water that turn pink as Marines are hit before they even reach the beach. But the machines keep moving. They do what the Higgins boats cannot. They climb the coral shelf, grinding over the sharp limestone, and plunge into the deeper water of the lagoon, paddling relentlessly toward the seawall. When they hit the sand, the limitations of the LVT-1 and early LVT-2 become tragically apparent. There is no ramp. The engine is in the rear. To disembark, a Marine has to stand up, exposed to the sweeping fire from the bunkers, and vault over the high gunnels, dropping 8 feet to the sand. It is a moment of extreme vulnerability. Men are cut down in midair, their bodies draping over the steel sides of the tractors. Despite the carnage, the Amtraks deliver the assault waves. They crush barbed wire. They ferry ammunition to the seawall and take wounded men back to the reef edge. But the attrition is catastrophic. The Japanese 13 heavy machine guns and 47 anti-boat guns tear through the thin skins of the tractors. By the time the sun sets on that first bloody day at Bitillo, the lagoon is a graveyard of burning metal. Of the 125 LVTs that started the assault, 75 LVT-1s and 50 LVT-2s, only 35 remain operational. 90 vehicles are drifting wrecks or burning hulks on the beach. Yet without them, the 2nd Marine Division would have been slaughtered in the water, halted at the reef line 500 yards out. Tarawa was a victory, but it was bought with a lesson written in blood. The logistical carrier had become an assault vehicle, and it needed to evolve. The evolution was already underway, driven by the relentless pace of the Pacific War. While the drama at Tarawa unfolded, other units were proving the vehicle's worth in different hellscapes. Just weeks prior, on November 1, 1943, the 3rd Amphibian Tractor Battalion had landed Marines at Cape Torquena on Bougainville. Here, the enemy wasn't just the Japanese, it was the terrain. Bougainville was a nightmare of swamp and jungle. The LVT-2, the Water Buffalo, made its combat debut here. It featured a new powertrain, utilizing the engine and transmission from the M3 Stuart light tank, along with a suspension system designed for better durability on hard ground. At Bougainville, the water buffalo did what no truck could do. It swam from the transport ships, clawed its way over the soft sand beaches, and kept going, plunging into the festering swamps inland. It became the lifeline for the infantry, carrying rations and ammo through waist-deep muck that swallowed jeeps and 6x6 trucks whole. The Marines learned that these machines were not just for the water. They were all-terrain beasts that could operate where the map said impassable. Back in the United States, the engineers at the Food Machinery Corporation, FMC, and Borg-Warner were listening to the reports coming back from the Pacific. The biggest complaint from the infantry was the disembarkation. Jumping over the side was suicidal. The solution was a radical redesign that resulted in the definitive Amtrak of the war, the LVT-4. The engineers moved the engine from the rear to the front, placing it directly behind the driver's cab. This shifted the center of gravity and, crucially, opened up the entire rear of the vehicle. They installed a large drop ramp, similar to the one on the Higgins boat. Now the LVT could back onto a beach or drive inland, drop its ramp, and a squad of 24 Marines, or a jeep, or a field gun, could rush out under cover of the vehicle's own bulk. The LVT-4 was the workhorse the Corps had been waiting for. It was faster, safer, and more versatile. It became the most numerous variant of the war, with 8,348 units rolling off the assembly lines. But carrying troops was only half the equation. The Marines needed fire support that could swim with them. They needed tanks that didn't drown. The answer was the AmTank. The concept was simple. Take an LVT hull, armor it up to half an inch, deck over the cargo bay, and drop a tank turret on top. The first attempt, the LVT A-1, mounted a 37 gun from the Stuart tank. It was decent for bunker busting, but the Marines wanted more punch. They got it with the LVT A-4. The LVT A-4 was a floating artillery piece. It mounted the turret of an M8 Scott howitzer motor carriage, packing a short-barreled 75 howitzer. This wasn't for fighting other tanks. It was for cracking concrete and blasting entrenched infantry. On September 15, 1944, the utility of these armored hybrids was put to the test at Peleliu. The 1st Marine Division faced a coral fortress, defended by some of the most disciplined Japanese troops encountered yet. As the invasion waves approached the white and orange beaches, they were led not by troop carriers, but by lines of LVT A-4 AmTanks. These vehicles fired their 75 howitzers while still afloat, suppressing the enemy positions right up to the moment the tracks hit the sand. Once ashore, they didn't stop. They pushed inland, acting as light tanks, blasting pillboxes at point-blank range to clear a path for the infantry following in the cargo LVTs. The synergy was lethal. The AmTanks provided the cover, the cargo LVTs provided the men. However, the geography of the Pacific continued to throw up new challenges, each one demanding more from the machines and their crews. In February 1945, the island-hopping campaign reached Iwo Jima. This was not a coral atoll like Tarawa, nor a swamp like Bougainville. It was a geological anomaly rising from the sea, a place where the ground itself seemed to conspire against the invasion. Iwo Jima is sulfur and ash. When the 3rd, 4th, and 5th Marine Divisions approach the beaches on February 19, 1945, they are looking at a terrain that defies standard military logic. The bombardment has churned the island into a moonscape, but the geology is the real enemy. The beaches of Iwo Jima are not made of packed sand. They are composed of coarse, black volcanic ash, loose, shifting, and deep. It is a soft, unstable grit that offers no purchase for tires or boots. As the first waves hit the shore, the wheeled vehicles, the trucks, the jeeps, the towed artillery, roll off the ramps of the landing craft and immediately sink to their axles. They are immobilized, sitting ducks for the Japanese artillery zeroed in from Mount Suribachi. Even the Sherman tanks struggle, their narrow tracks spinning uselessly in the black drift. The invasion threatens to stall at the water's edge, creating a congested kill zone of stalled machinery and exposed men. Once again, the solution is the Amtrak. The LVT, with its wide, paddle-cleated tracks, floats over the ash where everything else sinks. On Iwo Jima, the Amtrak ceases to be just a landing vehicle. It becomes the island's entire logistical circulatory system. For days, they are the only link between the fleet and the front lines. They do not stop at the beach. They grind up the steep terraces, ferrying ammunition, water, and blood plasma directly to the foxholes. Inside the steel hull of an LVT-4, a driver fights the controls. The heat is suffocating, compounded by the tropical sun and the engine roaring just behind his back. The vehicle reeks of exhaust, cordite, and the metallic tang of dried blood. He drives a relentless loop, up the terrace with crates of grenades and .30 caliber rounds, kicking up rooster tails of black dust. Down the terrace with a cargo bay full of wounded Marines, their stretchers lashed to the gunnels, praying the Japanese mortars don't find the open top of the vehicle. The ash clogs the air filters, the volcanic grit grinds the track pins down to nothing. But the machines keep moving because there is no alternative. Without the LVT on Iwo Jima, the flow of supplies stops and the evacuation of the wounded halts. The invasion would suffocate on the beach. By the spring of 1945, the Amtrak has evolved from a desperate improvisation into a mature weapons system. The final test comes on April 1, 1945 at Okinawa. This is the largest amphibious assault of the Pacific War, a massive projection of power aimed at the doorstep of the Japanese home islands. Here, the 9th Amphibian Tractor Battalion lands the 6th Marine Division. Among the waves of steel hitting the Hagushi beaches is the final wartime evolution of the breed, the LVT-3 Bushmaster. The Bushmaster is the result of years of hard-learned lessons from Guadalcanal to Peleliu. It features a ramp like the LVT-4 but offers better armor protection and a more powerful drive system. It is designed not just to survive the water but to fight on land. At Okinawa, the doctrine shifts. The Amtraks are no longer treated merely as boats that can crawl. They are used as armored personnel carriers, operating in a manner that foreshadows the mechanized infantry tactics of the future. They push far inland, supporting infantry advances through rice paddies and up muddy ridges, acting as mobile pillboxes and heavy haulers in terrain that would break a conventional truck. But the cost of this aggressive usage is staggering. The Japanese defense at Okinawa is fanatical, utilizing heavy artillery and suicide tactics. The Amtraks, pushing deep into the lines, are hammered. The 9th Amphibian Tractor Battalion begins the Okinawa campaign with 103 operational LVTs. They face weeks of grinding combat, traversing mud, crossing rivers, and assaulting fortified ridges. By the time the battalion is ordered to assault the Oroku Peninsula to flank the Japanese naval cave fortifications, the attrition is nearly total. Of the 103 vehicles that roared ashore on April 1st, only 17 serviceable LVTs remain to carry the assault. The rest are scrap metal, gutted by mines, shattered by artillery, or simply worn out by the relentless operational tempo. While the Amtrak is immortalized in the Pacific, its tracks also left their mark on the other side of the world, a theater often omitted from the LVT's history. The war in Europe was a war of rivers, and by 1945, the Allies faced the greatest water barrier of them all, the Rhine. The U.S. Army, having watched the Marine Corps' success in the Pacific, had adopted the LVT in huge numbers. In March 1945, as Allied forces prepared to plunge into the heart of Germany, they brought the Alligators and water buffaloes with them. The conditions were different, no coral reefs, no ocean swell, but the current of the Rhine was treacherous, and the opposite banks were steep and defended. During the Rhine crossings, the LVTs provided a capability that standard bridging equipment could not match: immediate assault lift. They didn't have to wait for a bridge to be built. They simply drove into the river, fought the current with their tracks, and climbed the mud banks on the German side, disgorging infantry and supplies before the Wehrmacht could effectively react. It was a strange sight for the European theater. vehicles born in the Florida swamps and forged in the Pacific atolls, now ferrying GIs across the legendary river of the German fatherland. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the scale of the LVT program stood as a testament to American industrial might. From a single prototype in a Florida backyard, the production lines had swelled to deliver 18,616 vehicles of all variants. The LVT-4 alone accounted for 8,348 of these, a number that dwarfs the entire armored vehicle production of many combatant nations. The story of the LVT is one of the most remarkable engineering pivots of the war. Donald Roebling's invention, the Alligator, was designed to rescue hurricane victims from the muck of the Everglades. It was a machine of mercy. But history and the necessity of global conflict repurposed it into a machine of conquest. It was the answer to the coral reef, the solution to the volcanic ash, and the key that unlocked the island fortresses of the Empire of Japan. For the Marines who rode them, the experience was a sensory assault that began long before the enemy opened fire. It was the smell of hot oil and exhaust trapped in the humid air of the cargo bay, the deafening, bone-rattling vibration of the tracks clawing against the steel deck of the LSD, and the sickening lurch as the heavy machine plunged from the ramp into the swell. It was a ride into the unknown, encased in a steel box that offered salvation from the deep water, but only marginal protection from the high-velocity steel waiting on the shore. By the time the Pacific War culminated at Okinawa on April 1, 1945, the Amtrak had undergone its final wartime metamorphosis. The invasion of the Ryukyu Islands was an operation of staggering magnitude, dwarfing even the Normandy landings in terms of the sheer distance the force had to be projected. The 9th Amphibian Tractor Battalion, tasked with landing the 6th Marine Division, brought with them the LVT-3 Bushmaster. This was the machine the operators had been asking for since Guadalcanal. While the LVT-4 had solved the cargo handling issue with its rear ramp, the Bushmaster was built with the understanding that the Amtrak was no longer just a ferry service. It was a combat vehicle. The LVT-3 featured a ramp like its predecessor, but the engineers had rearranged the internal architecture to improve survivability and power. The engines were moved into the sponsons, the side walls of the vehicle, freeing up more cargo space and providing a layer of machinery between the enemy fire and the troops inside. It also featured an automatic transmission, a luxury that reduced driver fatigue during the grueling, hours-long ship-to-shore transits. But the most critical improvement was the armor. The Bushmaster was designed to take a hit and keep moving, a necessity for the kind of warfare that awaited on Okinawa. When the 9th Amphibian Tractor Battalion hit the Hagushi beaches, they didn't just drop their ramps and retreat to the reef. The doctrine had shifted entirely. The commanders realized that the LVT's ability to traverse impassable terrain made it invaluable for the inland fight. Okinawa was a rugged, rain-soaked island of clay ridges, rice paddies, and stone escarpments. The roads were quickly pulverized into quagmires by the heavy traffic of trucks and tanks, where wheeled vehicles bogged down, spinning their tires in the thick red mud. The LVTs floated over the top. They became the primary armored personnel carriers for the campaign, pushing miles inland to support the infantry assaults on the Shuri line. This aggressive usage, however, exposed the tractor crews to a level of violence previously reserved for tank battalions. The Japanese defense of Okinawa was built around attrition, utilizing heavy artillery, mortars, and suicidal close-quarters attacks. The Amtraks were large, slow targets. As they ferried supplies up the muddy draws and evacuated casualties from the fire-swept ridges, they were hammered. The statistics of the 9th Amphibian Tractor Battalion tell the grim story of this new tactical reality. When the campaign began on April 1st, the battalion fielded 103 operational LVTs. They were brand new, painted in fresh camouflage, their tracks tight and engines humming. Over the next 2 months, those 103 machines were subjected to a relentless grinder. They were blown apart by mines hidden in the soft earth. They were shattered by 47 anti-tank guns firing from concealed caves. They were simply worn into scrap metal by the ceaseless demand for movement over unforgiving terrain. By the time the battalion was ordered to execute a short-ashore assault on the Oroku Peninsula to outflank the Japanese naval forces entrenched there, the unit was a shadow of its former self. Of the original 103 vehicles, only 17 serviceable LVTs remained to carry out the mission. The rest were smoking husks scattered across the Okinawan landscape, or sitting in repair depots with their suspensions sheared off. The crews, depleted and exhausted, cannibalized parts from the wrecks to keep the surviving 17 running, patching bullet holes with scrap steel and sheer will. While the Amtrak is indelibly linked to the coral reefs and palm trees of the Pacific, the vehicle's utility was not confined to a single theater. The war in Europe was a different beast, a war of hedgerows, cities, and vast plains, but it was also a war of rivers. The Wehrmacht, in its retreat towards the German heartland, systematically destroyed bridges behind them, turning every river into a defensive moat. The greatest of these was the Rhine, the mythical barrier protecting the German interior. By March 1945, the U.S. Army had recognized the unique capabilities of the machine the Marines had championed. They didn't face coral reefs, but they faced swift currents, steep muddy banks, and heavy defensive fire from the opposite shore. Standard bridging equipment took time to assemble, time that allowed the enemy to regroup. The LVT offered the element of surprise. During the Rhine crossings, specifically Operation Plunder and the earlier crossings at Remagen and Nierstein, the Army deployed amphibious tractor battalions equipped with LVT-2s and LVT-4s. The scene on the Rhine was a stark contrast to the tropical landings. Instead of the blinding blue of the Pacific, the water was cold, gray, and fast-moving. The backdrop was not jungle, but the shattered industrial skyline of the Ruhr and the rolling German countryside. Yet the mechanics of the assault were identical. The LVTs entered the water upstream, fighting the current with their paddle tracks, low in the water, engines roaring against the flow. They carried infantry from the 3rd and 7th Armies, ferrying them across the broad river under the cover of smoke screens. When they reached the far bank, the LVT's climbing ability proved decisive. The riverbanks were often steep, slick with mud and ice, impossible for a standard boat to unload against and difficult for infantry to scramble up under fire. The Amtrak simply drove out of the river, their cleats biting into the German soil, and carried the troops directly up the banks to the high ground. They allowed the Allied forces to establish bridgeheads rapidly, bypassing the choke points of destroyed bridges and keeping the momentum of the invasion alive. It was a strange sight for the European theater, vehicles born in the Florida swamps, perfected in the Central Pacific, now churning through the waters of the Rhine, carrying GIs into the final battles of the Third Reich. The water of the Rhine was not the warm, azure salt of the Pacific. It was cold, gray, and swollen with the spring melt, moving with a heavy, muscular current that threatened to sweep a stalled vehicle downstream into the sights of German anti-tank guns. For the GIs of the U.S. Army standing in the cargo bays, the experience was disorienting. These men were used to the solid steel of Sherman tanks or the canvas-covered beds of deuce-and-a-half trucks. Now they found themselves afloat in thin-skinned tractors, bobbing in the chop of a river that had served as a psychological and physical barrier to invaders since the time of the Romans. The Army had watched the Marine Corps' bloody tuition in the Pacific closely. They saw that the LVT was the only vehicle capable of bridging the gap between the water and the hard ground without pause. In March 1945, during the massive crossings at Nierstein and Oppenheim, and later during Operation Plunder, the Amtraks were the tip of the spear. The Germans had blown the bridges, counting on the river to buy them time to reorganize. They expected the Allies to halt, bring up heavy engineering units, and laboriously construct pontoon bridges under fire. The LVT denied them that time. As the artillery barrage lifted, hundreds of LVT-2s and LVT-4s revved their radial engines and slid into the river. The current grabbed them immediately. Drivers, wrestling with the steering levers, had to crab the vehicles sideways, fighting the flow to keep their bows pointed toward the opposite bank. These were not mariners. They were tank drivers and tractor operators, forcing land machines to act as boats. The noise was deafening, the roar of the Continental engines echoing off the water, the splash of the tracks churning the river into a froth, and the sharp crack of German 20 flak skipping off the water's surface. Unlike the coral reefs of Tarawa, the challenge here was the exit. The banks of the Rhine were often steep, reinforced with stone dikes or slick with river mud. A standard Higgins boat would have grounded at the shoreline, forcing troops to wade through the shallows and scramble up the mud while exposed to machine gun fire. The Amtrak changed the geometry of the assault. As the tracks touched the river bottom on the German side, the grousers, the paddle-like cleats on the tracks, dug in. The engines roared, shifting from propeller drive to track drive, and the vehicles simply climbed. They hauled themselves up the slick embankments, dripping river water, and drove directly onto the floodplains, deploying infantry already organized and dry, ready to fight. LVT, A-4 Amtanks with their 75 howitzers and open turrets provided direct fire support from the water, suppressing bunkers on the far bank while the cargo variants ferried wave after wave of troops. It was a seamless projection of force that rendered the river barrier obsolete. By the time the Wehrmacht realized the speed of the crossing, the bridgeheads were established, and the Amtraks were already turning back to ferry the next wave. The Alligator had conquered the Rhine. This global ubiquity, from the volcanic sands of Iwo Jima to the industrial rivers of Germany, was made possible only by a staggering feat of production back home. The LVT was not just a tactical success. It was a triumph of American logistics and manufacturing. When the war began, the LVT was a niche concept, a curiosity. By the time the surrender documents were signed in Tokyo Bay, it was a mass-produced staple of the Allied arsenal. The numbers tell a story of industrial mobilization that is difficult to comprehend in the modern age. In the span of just a few years, American factories, primarily those of the Food Machinery Corporation, FMC and Borg-Warner, churned out a total of 18,616 LVTs of all variants. Consider the scale of that number. 18,616 complex, amphibious fighting vehicles. This figure exceeds the total wartime tank production of many combatant nations. The LVT-4 alone, the definitive ramped cargo variant that solved the logistical bottleneck at the beachhead, saw 8,348 units roll off the assembly lines. These factories, which had previously built agricultural pumps and sprayers for orchards, had completely retooled to build the vehicles that would carry the Marine Corps across the Pacific. The manufacturing process itself was a race against time. Engineers at FMC were constantly modifying the designs based on immediate feedback from the front lines. When the Marines at Tarawa reported that the unarmored LVT-1s were vulnerable to small arms fire, the factories began bolting on armor plate. When the troops at Saipan struggled to climb over the high sides of the LVT-2 under fire, the designers cut the rear open and installed the ramp that became the hallmark of the LVT-4. It was a dynamic loop of combat experience driving industrial output, a system where a lesson learned in blood on a Monday could result in a welding change on the assembly line by Friday. Yet, for all the steel and industrial might, the soul of the Amtrak remains tethered to a strange and poignant origin story. The machine that stormed the beaches of Normandy and Okinawa, that crushed the coral of Kwajalein and climbed the banks of the Rhine, was never intended for war. Its DNA was not forged in a weapons laboratory, but in the aftermath of a natural disaster. The story circles back to 1935, to a wealthy engineer and inventor named Donald Roebling. Roebling was the grandson of Washington Roebling, the man who built the Brooklyn Bridge. Engineering was in his blood, but his motivation was humanitarian. After witnessing the devastation of the 1935 Labor Day hurricane, Roebling was driven to create a machine capable of traversing the treacherous Florida swamps to rescue stranded victims. He christened this humanitarian invention the Alligator. a vehicle designed solely to save lives in the wake of natural disasters. It remains a profound irony that a vessel forged for mercy in the Everglades would ultimately find its fame as the armored spearhead of the Pacific War. If you would like more war stories from World War II, please like this video and subscribe to our channel.